Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Marj Ayyun, fought in 1179, a critical juncture in the protracted and tumultuous struggle between the Crusader states and the rising power of the Ayyubid dynasty. Some of you ask me, why don't you talk more about the Ayyubids? Of course, it's true we haven't really covered much of their warfare, namely actually Hattin is an exception to this, so I'm glad to have covered that back in the day. Already 3 hours of tactical analysis of the most important clash of the region in the era. Today we talk about this minor engagement that involves Saladin, and that is meticulously documented by William of Tyre, the prominent 12th century historian and archbishop of the same city, who served, as you know, as a key chronicler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. We don't read him for the first time, considering all the various Crusader battles that we covered on Schwerpunkt. This is interesting because before starting the channel, I wasn't really very familiar with Crusader battles rather than warfare per se, and I had, let's say, greater expectations coming from, admittedly, that was my bias, a bit of a later time in historiographical development, just a couple of centuries essentially, not even. But regarding the complexity of these battles, reconstruction mostly, right? Because these were definitely big engagements, but if it wasn't for these individual authors that at some point provide us with a specific narrative of the battle, we wouldn't really know much about them to core. Today we will be reading William of Tyre's Historia, translation right from the original Latin. There isn't any major issue of translation regarding the interpretation of the same battle. That is, in this sense, literally just the only narrative that we have about the tactical development. Then you can find references, of course, like, Ernul's Chronicle. There are also Islamic sources, Imad al-Din, Baldin, etc. There are, however, scarce informations about the clash there that do not really add much up to the overall so mysterious picture of the war. You could argue that you can even reconstruct these battles without knowing, for example, how big they were. Of course, there are scholarly estimates about the size of armies, but when the same historiography doesn't fundamentally care more than much, it's sort of difficult. We can think of, several thousands from the Christian side, tens of thousands from the Islamic one, not literally in that sort of scalar difference. But there is a pattern that we've seen also in other, in fact, Crusader battles, where you realize that the Western composition was more based on weight, sort of quality, in this sense, heaviness, lesser maneuverability overall for the sake of the effectiveness of the same tactics, whereas Islamic powers mostly relied on hit-and-run tactics. They tended to have the wars like in close sort of hand-to-hand fighting with the Westerners, but having greater outflanking capacity, like ambushing, at least proclivity, right? The Battle of Marj Ayyun is interesting because the Ayyubids are, as we have explained also in other battles covering them, but also the original warfare series, they're describing the military cultures of various, like in this case, regions like Syria, Egypt, that they were, in a sense, closer, right? This is especially the case for Egyptian armies, but also the Syrian ones that were, had a urbanized profile, some interesting militia. We talked about them in the military historical units series, were sort of more Mediterranean. In that sense, also more influenced by a broader pattern of, in fact, let's say, institutional solidity compared to, for example, the much more feudal, heavily Persified, but also ultimately in origin Central Asian Seljuk Turks that relied more on horse archery in proportion to the Ayyubids that still did, of course. That the by the way, the dynasty was originally Kurdish. They lived in sort of quite interesting locations where many different cultures superimposed to a degree. I still haven't made a video about the Ayyubid army per se. We talked about Egyptian forces, Egyptian development of the local military organization, mostly in the aforementioned regional warfare series, but we really have to get into the depths of this. And there is, of course, also a composite nature of these powers that, in the case of Saladin, is a bit, as you know, just a leitmotif of his political history, right? People tend to confuse at times the size of powers with their stability. Medieval powers at large, of course, were more unstable than the ones we know today at large. Speaking of bigger powers, etc., even though the Ayyubids had a hell of a power around, the same Battle of Hattin proved favorably for Saladin that was the last option to keep things together, like inflicting this heavy blow to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, so much so that the Holy City would fall itself, to save the solidity of this entire realm. And consider that the Saint Kingdom of Jerusalem was, of course, smaller, was in a way more vulnerable, but in proportion was not rigged by the same levels of Islamic sort of skeptical undertone against secular rulers. Besides, there is this notion that Crusader states were to fall just for some higher deterministic reason. This is absolutely not true, and especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem was incredibly well placed in the Levant, and it's something we will have to come back on, because you can't really hear sometimes the strategic analysis made just like, oh no, that thing had to happen, whatever. As even prominent historians have said, that the only thing that the Europeans got from the Crusades were peaches or something like that. In any case, today I will follow the usual pattern of tactical explanation by reading simply William of Tyre. So it's that easy, because the only narrative we have about, again, the tactical development is his own. We don't fully understand the sort of the battleground, where the battle took place, say, in terms of single battle lines movements across what is this plain of Marj Ayyun. I will describe in a while. We have some specific references, but this is one of the many cases, like in medieval history, especially in this slightly earlier times, where and for relatively secondary clashes compared to the probably the biggest regional ones, that this wasn't, even though it was pretty relevant, as we will see now. Regarding the actual plague, we don't have any specific topographic information that makes us say, okay, this is easily how the battle went. In fact, of course, whenever I make these videos, up to a certain point, late medieval warfare, collecting all the primary sources on the on probably the fight, because that's what I study in these types of battle videos, is feasible. But when there is, in fact, even such shorter information from the same primary sources, I normally check, as I also do for the rest, scholarship. And scholarship hasn't provided us with, in fact, more informed explanation of how this battle actually went now at a local tactical level, because we really don't know. And so also historians legitimately wouldn't venture into a ground that we know a few of. Besides, I searched also, which means at the end of the day that I haven't made a map of the battle, because at that point, like, it would have been just guessing, attempting, but on really a speculative basis, and so it's a waste of time to this degree. Besides, I have actually lots of pictures here, as you can see, they're quite pertinent, but I couldn't find, because I usually do this also for the battle videos, find any expandable Wikimedia Commons image, which is basically the only type that at this point you can use for commercial purpose and without violating anyone's copyright, about Marj Ayyun. There are a couple of pictures, but they do not show sort of the plane, the place in general. There are just photos in close places. In any case, and I will not show you this because you can do yourself a favor to set the relief filter on Google Maps and search for Marj Ayyun and looking at the terrain. That definitely has some specific feature that is referenced by William of Tyre himself, but still it's too vague to say what happened exactly where, which time of the clash, and by which units, and so on. So we will make some considerations on that basis that I can simply tell you by voice without showing you even the map. Otherwise I would do it, because again, I love this. But it's more, again about the narrative, and so the journey you can argue. I will, however, give, just to lengthen the video a bit of political and strategical background. Right, this battle essentially unfolds during the reign of Baldwin IV, who had ascended to the throne of Jerusalem in 1174 at the tender age of 13, following the death of his father, King Amalric I, on July 11th, 1174. Baldwin's rule was profoundly shaped by his diagnosis of leprosy, notoriously enough, a debilitating condition that became apparent during his childhood and gradually worsened, necessitating the appointment of regents to govern in his stead during periods of incapacity. Among these regents was Raymond III of Tripoli, a seasoned nobleman who assumed significant responsibility for the kingdom's administration during Baldwin's minority, a role that underscored the political fragility of the realm. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, established in the aftermath of the First Crusade, as you know, 1099, under the leadership of figures like Godfrey of Bouillon, had by the late 70s of the 12th century evolved into a complex feudal entity sustained by a network of fortified cities and castles, including Tiberias, Safed, Toron, and Sidon, which served as vital outposts against the encroaching Islamic forces. I also made a video from slightly later time regarding the actual organization that we are aware of, documentarily speaking, at some point, about properly the Kingdom of Jerusalem, all the various cities' contributions, the money thieves, the various vassals, retinues to serve the crown with. This is the Jean de Belin's Assise de la Haute Cour. We are in 1265, so it's quite deteriorated time, closer for your interest to the video that I made about the siege of Acre, one of the few sieges that I've dealt with as a battle overall, because it's so important, especially for as the fortress of the major avant-post. Not quite the last, telling the truth, but the last sort of meaningful one for original control, in fact, of the same kingdom of Jerusalem. But back to our time, politically, the realm was beset, as we've seen, already by internal divisions that undermine its ability to present a united front against external threats. And this was the main issue, not much a predetermined one by some strange dynamic. It's always politics. The nobility, composed of powerful lords, such as the aforementioned Raymond, and members of the military orders, like the Knights Templars and Hospitallers, often pursued their own interests, leading to frequent disputes over land, titles, and influence. If anything, the monastic military orders were probably the backbone of the Jerusalemetan military. They were properly conceived for that ultimate, mystical, self-sacrificial mission in holy combat that marked, in many ways, the peak of the soul of chivalry during the Middle Ages. And we will look at multiple videos about all the main monastic military orders. Then we will get a bit more in depth with them, because it doesn't simply stop to make the military historical unit video for the Knight Templar, Hospitaller, etc. Admittedly, these were very elite forces, so that they did their job pretty well, but even a relatively contained defeat could really weigh on their numbers, and they couldn't simply be replaced in cost and experience and so on. The relations with Europe in many ways were the other Achilles heel of this of the Eurozone limit and manpower, most and general political commitment. The Knights Templar, that were of course the most powerful of the monastic military orders at this point, in particular wielded considerable autonomy compared to the same king under their Grand Master Otto of Saint-Amand, who is prominently featured in William of Tyre's account of the Marj Ayyun campaign, as we will see. This internal discord was compounded by the absence of a strong, healthy monarch, as Baldwin IV's leprosy limited his physical leadership and forced reliance on advisors whose loyalties were not always aligned with the crown. What kind of nest of snakes in some cases these courts could really become. I also described in the video about Conrad of Montferrat, that is also close to these events, especially in later times. Meanwhile, the Islamic world was undergoing a period, we were anticipating that before, of consolidation under Saladin, who, following the death of Nur ad-Din in 1174, emerged as the preeminent leader of the Ayyub dynasty because he basically managed to expand his power from the Sultanate of Egypt also essentially in the Syrian world, and therefore also taking like the Crusader states between two fires that were quite, in fact, hot to handle, so much that the same Saladin was about to get burned with that, because it was incredibly complicated to just to have connections to a degree in a broader strategical and logistical sense, but the greatest threat was political, and it was mostly deriving from the general situation, not much just from the Crusaders per se. Saladin had, thus by 1177, unified in terms of personal dominions, Egypt and much of Syria under his rule, establishing a formidable power base that enabled him to launch a series of military campaigns aimed at naturally reclaiming territories lost to the Crusaders. Historical records, including William of Tyre's Historia, detailed that Saladin had conducted at least 2 prior invasions of the Sidon region before 1171, systematically plundering, burning, and slaughtering with little effective resistance from the Crusader forces, which was a signal, of course, of their relative impreparation. These raids, which targeted the fertile lands and strategic coastal approaches around Sidon, a key Crusader-held port city, you know how dependent the Crusader states, outre-mer, were on especially like the naval, the maritime connections, especially with the Italian maritime republics, weakening thus the kingdom of Jerusalem's eastern defenses and signaling the Islamic intent to expand Saladin's dominion towards the heart of the Crusader states themselves. Strategically, the region surrounding Marj Ayyun held thus immense importance as a contested frontier zone between the Crusader territories and the expanding Ayyubid domains. Located near the Litani River, close to the modern-day town, in fact, of Marj Ayyun, which is the same, it's just spelled in a different fashion, in southern Lebanon, the area was characterized by its rugged terrain, including the Lebanon mountain range to the northwest, and the river valley that provided both natural barriers and potential choke points. So if you actually look at the map, we will see it better later, you can clearly see how steep, by the way, the Lebanese mountains are, following the same course of the Litani River. So essentially, on the east of the Litani River, you have the plain of Marj Ayyun, in the northeast of the Seine, and the Crusaders, as you will see, were coming from the interland on the west bank of the waterway. That was quite well held. In fact, what stood at the top of the aforementioned ridge was the Beaufort Castle. The presence of such significant strongholds, such as also around in the broader region, for example, Banias, there was an Islamic-controlled town near the River Dan, and Crusader fortifications like Toron, modern Tibnin, and the aforementioned Beaufort Castle near Arnoun underscored the region's military value. Banias, situated near the headwaters of the Jordan River, served as a strategic base for Saladin's operations. allowing him to project power into the Crusader heartland. The Litani River flowing westward toward the Mediterranean acted as a natural boundary and a critical resource, while the mountainous terrain offered vantage points for observation and defense. Right, and Saladin's decision to establish during this campaign his camp between Banias and the River Dan, as noted by William of Tyre, reflected a deliberate strategy to disrupt Crusader supply lines and communications, employing light cavalry to conduct swift raids into the surrounding territories. These raids, which had, as we've seen previously devastated the Sidon region, prompted response from Baldwin IV, who, despite his deteriorating health, mobilized an army to confront the Ayyubid threat. Departing from Tiberias, a major Crusader stronghold on the Sea of Galilee, so we were substantially south than Marj Ayyun, tens of kilometers, Baldwin's forces marched northward through Safed, a fortified castle in Toron. So this is actually in the hinterland. If you follow the path, it could be, again, even fairly well reconstructed. Again, I haven't found any specific work detailing with sort of great academic insight the entire issue, but again, that's how few we know. The king had the intention, of course, intercepting Saladin and protecting the Jerusalemetan eastern frontier. This movement was not merely a military necessity, but obviously a political statement, as Baldwin sought to assert his authority over his fractious nobles and demonstrate his commitment to defending the realm. The strategic landscape of Marj Ayyun, with its blend of open plains and defensible heights, set the stage for a confrontation that would test the resilience of the Crusader states against Saladin's growing military prowess. Though, as we've seen, the specific tactical maneuvers are relatively unknown, right? What matters, however, in the intentions of both contenders was, of course, to come to a broader clash that could test, essentially, the political strength of both sides. If you have this plain, and you, of course, Saladin had the initiative in a strategic sense, but the Crusaders now are basically triggered enough to give battle themselves. This place is one where we will not talk much about the outcome of Marj Ayyun because, again, this video is stopped to the battle, and if anything, we will make other campaign ones in other episodes. But is the hope to, again, risk a bit, but without creating an immediate strategic disaster, so that even if things go the worst way, at least there's a contained amount of troops, an important one that you don't want to waste, but that at the same time it can't basically fall back into this, especially from the Crusader state side, on this mountainous hinterland, entrenching in specific castles. Equally, Saladin has this power, and he needs to test the enemy and hopefully inflicting him yet another loss to go by degrees. Christians would hope, of course, to weaken Saladin's reputation, authority, and control over his lands. So let's simply read William of Tyre's battle account. In June, Saladin, here from other, of course, activities, like he spent most of his time at war, and also just was active in the previous month. He decided to make another invasion. Accordingly, he located his camp between the city of Banias and the river Dan and sent out skirmishers in large numbers to drive off booty and set fires. This is a typical strategy that safeguarded the nuclei of sort of the lighter armies compared to the western ones. We've seen the Magyars behave like this, the Seljuks did. By the way, at this point, Saladin has control of Syria that had been importantly influenced by that Central Asian warfare. So again, there are differences, as we said before, between Egypt, Syria, and other, let's say, also, for example, Iraqi military culture, etc. However, it's not like Islamic armies differed so much, after all, between one another. Look at previous Crusader battles compared to Crusaders in particular. Saladin himself, ready to aid in emergencies, remained in the camp and there awaited the return of these lighter troops. and the result of their aggressions. You sent these guys that forage, plunder, but they also explore, they refer at a significant distance. Meanwhile, the news that Saladin was laying waste our lands in this fashion reached the king. Taking with him the cross of the Lord, he hastened to the city of Tiberias with all the forces he could muster from every source. So this is essentially a strategic background we provided. From there he went on through the town of Safed and the ancient city of Naasson and arrived with his forces at Toron. Here he received accurate information from the messengers who were constantly going and coming that Saladin with his army was still in the same position. He had sent his light-armed cavalry on ahead, however, to lay waste the fields of Sidon, and there, in hostile fashion, they were killing, burning, and plundering. After consultation, therefore, it was unanimously determined to advance against the foe. In accordance with this plan, the Christians directed the army from Toron toward Banias and came to a village called Mesafar. This was located on the top of a mountain. By the way, the locations of these smaller villages, it's I don't know, I'm sure it can be reconstructed, but I don't think we're really sure because names change, and generally speaking, there are others that sound similar. You can make all the case, but as you look at the map, as we will understand now, of course, and we already explained before, the Christian forces were coming from the hinterland, right, of Lebanon at this point. So the broader pressure that was placed by by Saladin's light troops on especially the northern part of the sector, because Sidon is far north, right? So basically what Saladin had done was setting, as we will see, in a Marj Ayyun, and his forces were sent northwest. So actually, of course, he had different ones roaming all around. We're talking about tens of kilometers. So this is a day's range, especially for lighter predatory troops. It's easy to cover, laying waste this territory, and so to provoke also the same crusaders. So this was partly wanted, but as we'll see now, the Islamic forces of Saladin, the heavier ones, are caught a bit by surprise by the arrival of the crusaders that moved, in fact, in this interland, coming from, as we've seen, as far as Tiberias, that is more than a couple of days of march, especially in the interland of these mountains. Right now, we will explain better what we think about battlefield and why, and what was in fact the Crusader strategy in this picture. So this was the village of Mesafar was located on the top of a mountain, and from it could be seen the entire region below, as far as the base of the Lebanon range. The enemy's camp was also visible in the distance, and the conflagrations and ravages committed by them as they scoured the country either and yon were evident to all. So here we think that the Crusader army had come to be particularly close to Marj Ayyun, right? And in fact, the same Lebanon range is there. Like there are some heights, specifically the one of Beaufort Castle are, as we've seen, located at 600 meters of altitude. Here, I can't see specifically in the surrounding anything necessarily higher. Actually, it seems also in the north, everything is lower, 400 meters. So it's likely in this position, it is fairly well sheltered and located essentially along the Litani Valley that the Christians would have likely set their camp to. And from there, you can see, in fact, also Marj Ayyun, which is where Saladin forces really were. We're not actually told, because Marj Ayyun is like in the center of the plain. So we don't know whether it was there or whether Saladin himself encamped somewhere else. Consider this was a fairly sizable army, to say the least. At a provincial level, at least it was easy to spot one another. Here, apparently, the Crusaders had come to in haste, right? Because William says the infantry troops, so our own, like the Crusader ones, wearied to exhaustion by the long march, could not keep up with the pace of the knights as they rode swiftly down the mountainside. So, as we'll see later, it seems like they're just entering the plain of Marj Ayyun to attack Saladin's camp, main force, right? Well, also these other Islamic forces were scattered out there. And so there would be essentially descending the Lebanon range, more or less where the Beaufort Castle is located, in crossing the Litani, and again, feeling really as if that's a good base to start from, to eventually fall back to in case of disaster, while easily and straightforwardly targeting Saladin's main force. So it makes a lot of sense as a strategy. The separation of cavalry and infantry is plausible, possibly less because of necessarily the exhaustion or long march. It depends on how these troops would have arrived. I mean, tactically is unlikely, but strategically is possible, meaning that if the Crusaders had rushed as a whole, as we've seen, this composite feudal contingent to Marj Ayyun, and they found out that as we will see now, Saladin's camp was sort of vulnerable, that he was caught off guard, that he had risked too much, it's possible that the knights would have immediately said, okay, let's ride on them now. Who cares about the infantry? Things are probably, because later the thing is relatively explained. This was an era where cavalry and infantry, if you look at, this is 1179, 3 years before the Battle of Legnano, several years before with Carcano, you have literally cavalry and infantry fighting almost separated battles, right? And or having an important degree of tactical autonomy from one another. So this is absolutely not strange for Frankish warfare to witness in the Crusades as well. And it sort of makes sense. We'll reflect on that a bit better later. In any case, this is the thing. The infantry troops, wearied again to exhaustion by the long march, could not keep up with the pace of the knights. So the explanation is also, yes, the knights are on horseback, but it's not like having cavalry moving. It's simply less exhausting for the same knights or the horses. It depends also because you have your own attendants, you have the wagons, so the infantry is there. So there is also the vexata question of who were these infantrymen actually, because there were many non-Frankish elements in the Jerusalemetan army as well, and it's possible that the knights said, these guys suck because they're not really like us and whatever. This is speculative. I'm sure that if you read the rest of William of Tyre's work, you can find useful insight on the topic. Nevertheless, but the point here is not even that the infantry had not arrived there with the knights. It says that basically were exhausted, and the knights rode swiftly down the mountainside by leaving them behind. And the infantry was advancing as well. So you understand that tactically wise, there is some sort of detachment, but ideally they would have fought together, and that was also the basic way to go for anybody. So there's not a mistake here. There is some level of a tactical, let's say, lack of tactical coordination. Here we are not given literally any info, right? But these troops, as we said before, could work also on their own. We will see now what actually happened. So William goes on and says, accompanied by only a few of the more active foot soldiers, which may, again, entail the aforementioned, like there were some foot soldiers saying maybe the Frankish ones were better than the locals, right? Therefore, the cavalry descended to a place commonly known as Merguim. This is in the Latin chronicle that we are translating, in the plain directly below the mountain. So we are definitely talking about that location. The castle of Beaufort was there, so that's definitely the strong position that you want. This plain of Marj Ayyun I see here is just 10 kilometers, I think, in length. So it's like you would expect, like it's not even, yeah, there are sort of ups and downs. The lowest part is closer to the Litani River, that is sort of more on the Crusade side, and then you have the slopes that rise up to 200 meters, where you have the in fact the town of Marj Ayyun on the other side. So this may have been likely the site of Saladin's camp, if anything, for such a large army like we presume he had, as we've seen, in order to launch this invasion, to lay waste like an entire province. And so this would actually favor, depending on the location that we don't have clear information on, the Muslims as east as they were, meaning that if the Crusaders had crossed it toward Marj Ayyun, they would have gone uphill, basically. And consider this in June in Lebanon. It's not really such a pleasant experience, but this is true also for the Muslims as well. Just every complication is amplified, let's put it this way, by heat. Now, Lebanon range, the enemy camp. Okay, we've seen this. The plane directly below the mountain. So the cavalry and this more active foot soldiers are, however, the source says, halted for several hours to deliberate over their further course. So much so that some scholars said also, but it's possible that during these hours, the aforementioned infantry would have caught up with them if they were to be deployed anyway for battle, right? And it's also interesting that, regardless of this initial impetus, right, to say, okay, let's descend into the plain, and so let's go for battle, they didn't necessarily know too well what to do in the moment, possibly because they didn't know exactly where Saladin's camp was, but we've seen before that they had actually sighted it. They could see everything. It's not really clear. Of course, there was some, as we'll see now, Muslim movement in all this, so you had to be very careful where you went, and as in the Jerusalemitan forces were not infinite. The Westerners at large were aware that there were also these lighter troops in the West. It's complicated. William does not quite explain everything. But he writes, in the meanwhile, Saladin became somewhat alarmed at the unexpected arrival of the king. He was anxious about his advance guard, who seemed to be shut off from himself and the army, and feared also that this camp might be attacked. Right, his camp may be attacked. Which evidently was a strategical plausibility that also the Crusaders were going for. So again, roughly, those were the intentions. We don't know how many troops were in this vanguard, but again, if we assume that there were at least the majority of the lighter component, they were really needed by Saladin because everything worked by combined armed tactics. The Franks at large relied on heavy cavalry and heavy infantry, and the Ayyubids on heavy cavalry and lighter cavalry. Of course, they had infantry themselves. We talked about the Syrian Haddad infantry militia that we even made a military historical unit video for. So the Crusaders themselves would have had some so-called Turkopol as horse archers, and that were not even necessarily locals, especially after almost 1 century of Frankish stay, so to say, in the Holy Land, but Frankish themselves. Nevertheless, those outlined were more or less the bulk of their army organization and tactics. So here Saladin really feared, again, that his camp might be attacked. He therefore ordered the baggage impedimenta and all the equipment to be placed between the wall and the forewall of the neighboring city, where it could easily be found, whatever the result of the battle might be. Now, I'm not sure whether this is actually Marj Ayyun. Again, this seems to be the most plausible scenario, because, again, there might have been Maybe he was located somewhere else, which would have not been too distant in terms at least of a day of march, but it's unclear at least. You may wonder why Saladin that was, as you know, a great strategist, a formidable commander, would have exposed himself to so much, right? To just sit there in Marj Ayyun sending his tactically valuable vanguard that sure would have been needed, in fact, in an open field confrontation, that he was inviting his opponent to by sitting there and laying waste to his countryside. This will not be clear. You see, had we just another source regarding, say, an independent, an original one, because often these sources are sort of, as we've seen, for example, in the recent video about the Battle of Antioch, often either interdependent or based off a single source that, in any case, we don't know of. Like, we may have some broader idea, but most of the time it's a bit like in classical antiquity. Like, even the greatest historians of the time used sources that we can't really trace anymore, or we never really had an idea. Even in the time they would have known that, but say even after centuries may have been relatively forgotten already. So here Saladin is also wondering what was going to happen. He really was caught off guard. He says, thus prepared, but very doubtful to prepare for the battle, but very doubtful of the result. He awaited the outcome of events. Besides, consider here the situation. He's awaiting for his vanguard to come back in a way, and as we'll see now, the Crusaders have already arrived. So in the bigger picture, first of all, this tells you that we're talking about also consistent contingents that may have not much just of a tactical but a strategical problem in saying, for example, coming back from a route that had been cut off, being caught themselves off guard at Similia. And let's see, in fact, what William writes. Meanwhile, the skirmishers, so these were the Islamic ones, who had gone out on a plundering expedition, learned with great alarm of our approach, and laying aside all other considerations, determined to reach their own lines if possible. So it rather seems like the Crusaders had, by advancing the plain of Marj Ayyun, were sort of compromising even the possibility of the Ayyubid forces to link up with one another. But after crossing the river between the land of Sidon and the plain where, as I have mentioned, our army was located, they encountered our forces. So that's exactly what happens. So we presume these Ayyubids were coming from the west, right? Having crossed the river, so just like the Crusaders did, right? And in fact, like the countryside of Sidon, as we've seen, was in the northwest, and the Litani River runs in that direction, mostly north-south there. And so if they entered the plain of Marj Ayyun, that's what happened. The Crusader army, as we've seen, was there. We don't know, again, whether themselves still with those weaker infantrymen lagging behind or not. We don't know. William doesn't tell us, so we really have no clue. And so there is this initial engagement. William says, a skirmish at close quarters immediately ensued, wherein the Christians, by the help of God, were victorious. Many had been killed and still more thrown to the ground. The enemy turned in flight and endeavored to gain Saladin's camp. Indeed, a light contingent, say of horse archers mostly, maybe even in relative, not panic, but sensibly worried and having had, for example, to abandon maybe their own forage, their own loot, etc., in this quite dangerous situation when the enemy is lined up in battle array out there, and they have sort of sensed this. Consider the Crusaders had seen this from the Lebanese range heights, right? Was indeed a problem, and since, as we've seen, you have heavy cavalry, heavy infantry from the Crusader side, if these guys are lights, they're not going to make it, and that's exactly what happens. So, continuing the following chapter, while things were in this state odd, the master of the Knights Templars, accompanied by the Count of Tripoli and some others who were following them, ascended a hill lying opposite. Now, we don't understand here what kind of hill this is, right? A hill lying opposite what? Right? And from where, actually, because as we've seen also, the terrain is not so different. There is east of Marj Ayyun some, I think, higher ground rather than lower ground, right? So they would have not actually fallen on the other side because that's even more distant. It sort of doesn't make much of a difference. Again, we don't exactly know here whether Saladin was encamped exactly in Marj Ayyun, which is just in the northeast. This would make things easier. The terrain further northeast is rougher. It starts being proper mountain, and so again, we are not even particularly informed about the precise route that Saladin followed, but it would have not been a too easy one. Marj Ayyun was an opening also from the ground that Saladin had basically come from. So that's the reason why he may have been even obliged to sort of encamp at likely Marj Ayyun or in its surroundings, immediate surroundings, say its outskirts. As we've seen, he stores likely his own supplies in the local vault, but he, of course, as an army, is deployed outside as well. And to send maybe just from this opening troops in the territory of Sinai that is also fairly rugged, right? It's slightly lower, as we were saying before, in altitude, but it's fairly complicated, which partially, as we've seen, helped the Crusaders that also knew this territory generally better than Saladin himself. Again, not really clear, but we're told by William, again, the Knights of Templars ascended a hill lying opposite. On their left was the river, so we presume it's the Litanian. On the right, the Great Plain and the camp of the enemy. So from this direction, it seems like the Knights Templar had just basically descended into the plain. Because again, the Litani River is on the left, Marj Ayyun is on the right. There isn't the plain is in between. There isn't much of another place. West of the Litani, there is the Lebanese range. There is a mountain range. There is the Beaufort Castle. So, were the Templars kept in reserve? Say, do not go into the plain immediately, like this may be a trap, or which, as we've seen, is not necessarily the point because they had a good grasp of the surrounding. However, we had just been told by William that the Crusader army descended into the plain and yet stopped somehow for several hours to determine what to actually do. So why? The Knights Templars had not descended into the plain, that is agreed. Who knows? When Saladin learned, because as we'll see now, William does not like Ud, the Knights Templars master, so he probably wants to frame him in a sort of negative light, or one of, as we've seen, of intrigue, of mistake, if anything, also in a spiritual sense. William writes, when Saladin learned of the desperate plight of his men, exposed as they were to danger and even to death, so these were the lights that had been caught by the Crusaders in the open and were being butchered down, he prepared to go to their assistance. Which makes sense because you want to join forces, and again, it had not been the first time, nor the last, that battles also were fought a bit in this parceled fashion, in a plain. We're talking kilometers here, stretching, as we've seen, roughly this plain being 10 kilometers long, looking at this northeast to southwest axis. Right, so it's Yeah, maybe something slightly less, but if you consider the ups and downs, it's also considering the communications over the time, even though these were battle lines at large, they would have followed roads, but just approximately. You would have a piece of the army that engaged at a distance, right? Because if you consider the vanguard here, it means that, as it usually happened in this point, were normally two battle lines, of which maybe this was in fact part of, and or three or something like that. We're not told. But this sounds also like Saladin had, in fact, the command of the bulkier contingent and wanted to link up with the lights that still evidently had also some heavies among them, while the clash with the Christians was going on, so you could simply join forces, catching the Christians between two fires. This may be the reason why, for example, the Knights Templars may have not advanced up to that point, but this is the Saladin advances after the Knights had arrived, the Templar Knights had arrived. So William says, Saladin had reached this resolution when he caught sight of some of his defeated soldiers in full flight. So he calculated that if that battle line was wavering and part of it has already started crumbling, that was the moment where, he had to act, because the risk concretely, which is essentially what, as we'll see, would happen to the Crusader army. If one chunk was destroyed, you didn't know that. You could simply be overrun by the entire enemy force at some point. So either you withdrew and so you had lost the battle anyway, or you risked to lose the entire army even in the process. Which is very courageous from Saladin to do. This is a critical moment of the battle already. And so von Clausewitz explains what are your options there. But this is the moment where if you're served by luck, as Saladin was, you could obtain a great victory. William writes, he rode to meet them, and to meet his own troops, and on learning the situation, cheered them with encouraging words and sent them back to the ranks. Consider that Saladin was considered by his co-religionaries as a hero of Islam, right? A great champion of chivalry, a great lord, and one of great power and experience. So his authority and charisma were definitely very uplifting for this man, even though they had been broken, they had seen the fight there, they came back to fight in part. Then, suddenly, William writes, Saladin fell upon the Christians who were in reckless pursuit of the fugitives. So, Saladin intercepts, as it often happens, that chunk of the successful enemy army that had been pursuing his own, that had been, in the sense, basically broken, and that's a very risky situation for the Christians, to say the least, because normally you have, in part, broken the ranks. In any case, you're not fresh anymore, so if a fresh force comes into your face, you were not really aware that would have been the case, you were done for, or at least things would have gotten really, really heated and complicated. William writes, in the meantime, our infantry, enriched by the spoils of the slain, which is also interesting because, as we said, this was a vanguard Saladin had sent out to pillage, to plunder, etc. So it's possible that they still brought some of those riches. We're not talking necessarily here any camp, right? Because, as we've seen, Saladin had also stored his own supplies somewhere else. Here, we're not told that Marj Ayyun had been taken by the Crusaders in this victory in the process of so in the time our infantry reached by the spoils of the slain had encamped along the river bank. So this sounds properly the litany, right? And so they had partially just run north along it, where it's possible that the Ayyubid vanguard had been intercepted as coming out from the properly. In part, it's possible the same Litani Valley, because further north there is an opening from which possibly the Ayyubids had passed by going towards side, and now we're coming back to right. So let's imagine this infantry to descend from say, the Beaufort Castle, following the Litania up river. It's not that distant, it's like 4 kilometers, right? So this makes sense. Something you can't cover across the battlefield, and this guy's encamped there, plus there is the water helping them in this heated circumstance, right? And so this infantry was, say, enriched by disposals, like having camped along the riverbank in belief that a complete victory had been won, were quietly resting. Now, this is interesting because, again, how would this be necessarily considered like a complete victory? Like, of course, we don't have to take William's narrative as completely coherent, nor, again, specifically even and willingly complete or all explanatory, in fact, and following logics other than the ones that specifically the author followed for pursuit for his own broader idea of this whole work that you should understand just by reading as a whole, right? We have been told, however, that at least some infantry had been lagging behind and had descended maybe later than the rest of the force. And so maybe these were the infantrymen that, by the way, would have realistically cut down a cavalry force mostly composed of lights. It may make sense. They weren't, however, just infantry. In fact, it suggests that this force at large was unitary. In fact, William says the cavalry, however, realized that the enemy whom they had thought vanquished were rushing upon them with renewed vigor, which is yet another criticism to this infantry, basically saying the infantrymen are at least depicted as a bit as the lazy, the sort of dumber guys that do not know how war actually works. The cavalry, instead, especially the knights, realized that the enemy whom they had thought vanquished were, again, now coming at them as well. And William writes, in confused ranks without time or opportunity to reconstruct their lines and draw up their forces in battle array according to military rules, they fought bravely, and for a time resisted and stoutly sustained the enemy's attacks. Their strength, however, was unequal to that of the foe, and scattered and disorganized as they were, they could not aid one another. So the fact that the Christian force was spent, and here apparently not reordered for another engagement against an enemy battle line, especially after having pursued another defeated one, is plausible, right? The question is, why hadn't they understood this, right? Wasn't it clear that the enemy had sort of a scattered force, that there was probably like a vanguard, a party coming from the northwest, and hadn't they seen literally Saladin's camp and main force? Like, what happened there? It's as if William didn't tell us what was going on. Too much is fishy here. The fact that they descended in the plan, that they were so hasty in doing that, because they could see everything from the top, and they decided that probably Saladin was now caught off guard, but they stopped in the middle of the plain. And why? And then why also that reference to the Knights Templars, by the way? And what about that infantry? What kind of infantry is that? Were the stout, speedy, sort of more proactive footmen that William described before, or the sort of lazier bunch, the more tired bunch at least? So the less trained, probably militia. Again, there may be a bias against non-Franks here, doesn't matter. It's not explained. It's willingly not explained. By the way, this is a Christian defeat, so William would have not gotten necessarily this thorough death for different reasons. Maybe this was not even that important, but something strange here, right? Doesn't add up, especially, again, if you know that the enemy has the split force, and that likely the major one is in Marj Ayyun. You have at least to expect some attack from there. it's difficult. We don't know whether they had spotted, maybe they had spotted the camp, but they didn't know exactly how many troops were there. Of course, they had explorers, scouts, etc., but this is, again, strange. The Crusaders themselves had arrived also strategically, hastily to the theater, so even though they had that great view from the Lebanese mountain ridges, they might have not grasped exactly the Ayyubid forces distribution across the field. Also, why was this army apparently deployed on a single battle line, right? Because this is apparently what we're told. And again, it's not like in Crusader battles we've seen necessarily too much in-depth formations. Normally, the line is also singular. Here we're heading towards some more complex type of warfare, but we're talking Lebanon at the end of the 12th century. It's tough ground for both. Here, it mostly sounds as if, in fact, the vanguard body may have been consistently large because, again, there were lighter troops, and so there were tendentially more to put up a fight with some of their heavy components as well that would, by the way, hold up, because as we've seen, Saladin arrived at a moment where apparently not all his troops had been properly crushed. At least we're told just say after this by William that the infantry had thought, okay, we crushed them all. And at least the enemy was still being pursued. But it seems also that there might have been some kind of more cohesive resistance put up by the Ayyubid vanguard. And so when Saladin arrived with the best, maybe even less forces, but sort of more qualitative ones from the other side, the Crusaders were caught between two fires. William's description of how the Crusaders are overwhelmed, however, does fit more the scenario of, again, knights that are stretched, cavalry in general, like pursuing forces that are stretched after winning the battle, having broken ranks, which is very sort of normal at some point, but definitely reckless, right? Wasn't there a specific reserve or something? Is that the hint to the Knights Templars something about that? Let's read further because we can get some better picture of this regarding especially the Knights Templars. In any case, you understand what happened. The Ayyubids overwhelmed the Crusaders that are not properly lined up for battle after the pursuit, while Saladin's forces are. And so the guy really risked for the better. Consequently, they finally, so the Christians finally turned and fled in a disgraceful rout. They might easily have avoided the pursuing enemy and saved themselves by turning in another direction. This is how William puts it. But because of our sins, this is perhaps the most beautiful phrase from the account, they adopted a poorer plan and plunged into a narrow defile beset with steep cliffs. So other information, where the hell are these steep cliffs? Because except the Lebanese mountain range, there aren't. The plain of Marj Ayyun is pretty wide. There aren't steep cliffs unless you go further northeast, but we're talking something, again, considerably distant. Talking several kilometers, and you have sort of getting to it. And is it possible that Saladin's forces were actually there? Where are the steep cliffs? There isn't, like, I don't know, we've seen the Battle of the Horns of Aten, etc. Like, there is probably a geographic, you can read the battlefield as a book on the base of the orography, etc. What about this? Which steep cliffs? Where did the Crusaders go chasing Saladin, as a matter of fact? The only compression here is following the river, thinking that Saladin was in a place here that is really, there is really no actual settlement around. It's just like, if you follow the Litani River, really, the same, there's a bit north of the same place where we're saying before the Ayyubids perhaps came back from, but at that point they would have immediately linked up with Saladin, so it's not possible. They would have not found the Crusaders in between, right? So it's very strange. Very strange. It's not clear unless Saladin was somewhere the hills up north, just of Marj Ayyun. It's not clear at all. And that's why we don't know. And that's why scholarship basically said, okay, blip it, because it's not written, so we won't have to guess it. In any case, and by the way, William doubles down on this, says in this narrow defile beset with steep cliffs, it was impossible except at peril of death either to advance or to retreat through the enemy's lines. Why and how? Like, if they didn't even know where that there was another chunk of the enemy, how would you get into them without knowing how to come out, right? It doesn't make much of a sense, unless, of course, it was an ambush. The same Saladin troops were predisposed for that, but it doesn't seem like that. It seems rather that Saladin advances, finding this strain again of troops that are going towards his direction. And again, yes, we don't know, but there isn't such a straightforward interpretation. Also, armies can't make this enormous march throughout the day. And it sounds like Saladin himself was not really waiting for the Crusaders, but he went against them. So he was the guy who moved, according to the St. William's narrative. Going back to the Christians, William says, some crossed the river. So basically they crossed the Litani and they hopefully got back home there. In the hope of saving their lives, retreated to the nearest stronghold, which was called Belfort. In fact, that's exactly the castle of Beaufort, which is further south to any sort of choke point that we can think of here. And we don't know whether it had literally come from there or they had descended at another place. There is another path slightly north, but we're talking less than a kilometer away from that. So again, it's not clear at all. In any case, they would have come more or less from there as well. And as far as the position here, everything adds up. While others, after making the crossing, followed along the farther bank to Sidon and thus avoided the furious tide of battle. This is also interesting because it sounds like the enemy was coming, the vanguard of the Ayyubids was coming exactly from that direction. Even admittedly having defeated it and those guys sort of coming back east towards Saladin, wasn't there a risk to go there and still finding some more deer, right? So avoiding the furious tide of battle, by the way, this sounds more like not the previous battle, but this slaughter following the Christian route, right? By the way, William says, on the way to encounter Renaud of Sidon and his men who were hastening to the army. This was a contingent from Sidon that had been arriving to the site of battle too late, but on learning, in fact, of this disaster, Renaud heeded their warning and returned to Sidon. You might think that this would have been the best thing to do. When William instead writes, this act is believed to have been responsible for manifold disasters that day. So it's literally referring likely to these Sidonian troops that had basically, according to the author, at this point implicitly, maybe like reversed the tide of battle, like a flank attack on Saladin. If we think about him descending from the northeast and sort of pushing the guys down the Litani River towards Beaufort Castle, and the guy was coming from Sidon, so likely he was coming again from the same route the Ayyubid vanguard further north had crossed the Litani. It's possible it may have in turn, attacked the rear or the flank of Saladin's main force. This, however, would have to entail that the battle was not over yet when this was happening. So the previous phrase seems also at this point more connected to the fury of battle, because here we are talking about the guys we had crossed exactly in that point and had avoided still this, as William says, the furious tide of battle. And so They encounter the guy of Renaud of Sidon was advancing towards the battlefield, and while the battle apparently was still going on, and the Christians were about to be overwhelmed, maybe if that was the case, the guy retreated without doing anything about the situation, ultimately severed the Christians from their last chance of victory. Is it plausible? In this case, yes, because you can see how everything more or less adds up, and if you look at the map, you can imagine, roughly speaking, that the direction from which Saladin was coming was, in fact, Marj Ayyun proper. And that basically would have exposed this flank to a guy coming from Sidon, especially as you were pushing the enemy further south, right? They would have arrived on your right flank. In fact, William says, if he had continued his march, the Renaud of Sidon, to the fortress, so we're talking here Beaufort, he could probably have saved many from the enemy with the help of the townsfolk and the country people who knew the locality. And it was these fugitives hid that night in caves among the rocks. The next morning, the enemy, scouring every nook and corner, discovered them and threw them into prison. The king, however, by the aid of his royal soldiers, escaped without injury. The Count of Tripoli also reached Tyre with a few companions. So it rather sounds like the battle was already lost, which would put in better perspective why Renaud withdrew. But William seems to suggest that if the battle hadn't been won by him that day, he could have at least advanced up to Beaufort and allowed for the, together with local inhabitants, the fortress not to fall to Saladin. So the guy here, we don't know where he had met the first guys fleeing from the battlefield. Likely not too far away from it in the moment. It would have been difficult, of course, by finding scattered horsemen that were sort of faster in the escape to immediately grasp everything of what was going on. Imagine a situation of this kind. Of course, if the battle is lost, you're risking a lot to just being there in the first place. You don't know where the enemy is. You risk being captured. There's a possibility of ambush, etc. It's true, however, that Beaufort is such a good position that it would have been quite difficult for even the victorious army of Saladin to simply take. Even a few troops were roughly enough to stem the enemy. So, if not the battle, again, at least a great part of the strategic consequences of the battle could have been avoided, according to William, if Renaud of Sidon had intervened. The following day, basically, the people that had fled are found by the Ayyubids that captured them without anybody essentially protected, having nobody where to fall back, seeking the support of right end. And so this is how also Baldwin escapes, how the Count of Tripoli makes it out. William says, among the Christians who were captured at the time were Eudes de Saint-Amand, the master of the Knights Templars, a wicked man, haughty and arrogant, in whose nostrils dwelt the spirit of fury. This is an interesting picture, by the way. It's a biblical reference to Job 27:3. One who neither feared God nor revered man, which is quite interesting, especially considering all the voices on the Templars and the sense that they consider themselves somehow above the same church, at least in some in the preservation of some occult religious aspects of their military, so their martial practice and standards, etc. So the spirit of fury here is interesting because it sounds almost Tacitan, and in that sense of the fury, that is, however, also divine wisdom for acquired, like in the moment in which is delivered in combat. But here, of course, William is critical of him. He says, many people laid at his door the loss and never die in shame of this disaster. This is also interesting because if he had wanted really to shame him, he would have said actually that what he could have done or what he didn't do. Instead, we're just told before, if you remember, while things were in this state, the master of Knights Templars, accompanied by the Count of Tripoli and some others who were following them, ascended a hill lying opposite. Right, on their left was the river, and on the right was the great plain of the enemy camp. So it actually sounds like they entered, the geographical coordinates are clear here, they entered the plain of Marj Ayyun themselves. And we're not told about him. And then all of a sudden, we're told that it was sort of his fault if the battle had gone wrong. And we also have this the Reynald of Sidon could have done something, but he wouldn't. We're told that the Count of Tripoli was together with the Knights Templars, and that, however, he came back safely to Tyre with a few companions. So it sounds difficult. Like, it seems like they had actually been in the heat of action to lose all those men. So nobody really knows what the Templars' role was here, and it's literally all we know. William does not clarify it. Maybe he didn't want to be open about what had happened, because literally the guy was the Bishop of Tyre. There were all these rivalries. It was a very dangerous political situation, even to talk against the Templars to a degree, or there was a matter of honor at stake and a general sense of, of loyalty towards the institutions, even to the same temple. In a way, he doesn't criticize the Templars; he criticizes the master. Of course, in many ways, we will never know. It seems like this guy did something that, however, not even William wanted to reveal. Maybe because this entire tactical explanation, in fact, does not tell us everything, right? It's not, as we have seen here, that what William says is implausible. Actually, he says things that make sense, but that do not clarify certain aspects of the picture willingly, because he surely read this passage, was I don't know, dictating it, whatever. He decided not to be clearer regarding this event, right? In any case, what he was at least partially glad of, William writes, in fact, it said that within the year, the master of the Templars died a captive in a squalid prison, mourned by no one. So literally, like, the guy that nobody liked. Baldwin of Ramla, a noble and powerful man, was also captured there, as was likewise Hugh of Tiberias, the stepson of the Count of Tripoli, a young man of fine natural promise, greatly beloved by all. Many others whose names I do not know were also taken prisoners there. So you understand there is a minimal distance of William from these events that may render them relatively more obscure, right? And again, it's not clear in practice what the hell happened, but it also seems relatively clear that the explanation of this battle is a bit lazy, right? Or it's a bit reticent, a bit unclear, a bit unspecified, and this may well be in general line with the laconic character of certain accounts. But definitely William does not stand out as that, because he wrote this beautiful history that is so rich and that really puts all the elements out there, just doesn't specify what this whole thing should have gone down like. You understand, again, the people he was discussing were very powerful ones, and not figures that you would have simply sort of belittled or gone against without any specific accusation of some way. So again, there is something behind this, and it's not entirely clear what it is, but it may as well be something difficult to discuss that we will also likely never know. It's a beautiful battle for this. Mostly the mysteries entailed, as we've seen. It's not much like from these battles for example, a specific hatred or let's say concept of blame comes against the same Muslims, right? Those were the enemies. Saladin was a great commander. There isn't much of a doubt concerning what was actually happening in a broader political sense, right? Here, most of the accusations are directed at people that should have done their duty from the Christian side and wouldn't, because that was the only point possible to begin with. So it's, again, not entirely clear, or clear at all, by the way, what was really happening here. It's interesting. However, there is a broader plausibility, especially the fact that Crusaders were caught between two fires. Makes sense regardless of how united, not united they were. In all this, it's not like the Knights Templars were probably in command, in charge. The only hint that we're given here is it's as if they acted on their own, but we're not told how or why, and actually they seem to fall exactly in the same battlefield with all the others, even as we've seen their master being captured. We don't know, we're not told about, but normally these knights would fight to the death. We've seen there was or at least to exhaustion, that we've seen there were different notables captured, and there was this moment of resistance against Saladin's forces. It also goes on for a while, and so there are some lost chances, etc. Again, it's all interesting to explore in terms of who knows what actually happened, but unfortunately, this is the point. We don't really know. We're not really told what this whole thing really meant at this point. It rather seems like the battle was more or less fought in a pretty conventional manner, however, without also much of a, of course, of a lack from the Christian side. Apparently, Saladin fared pretty well, not just because of the outcome, of course, but the fact rather that he was able to seize this moment when he saw his enemies, because William talks, as we've seen, openly about it, and he pressed on at the right moment. So that's actually something commendable that the same Christian source points out. Like, look, the guy did what he had to do. He was intense enough, so to say, to move swiftly, to risk when he had to. Here, all of this can be, of course, interpreted as a criticism to those who hadn't done that. And obviously, this sort of is referred to the Christians and to these figures that are named as if they hadn't been good, they hadn't really done what they had to do. And in fact, it does really seem that, at least among the greater explanations, this may have been a point. We don't have, as we've seen, any specific information about the size of the various armies. We're just told when basically the Crusaders are attacked by Saladin without the possibility of reforming after reports, etc., that they were overwhelmed by a greater force. But in that sense, the greater force can be interpreted. Surely it was a greater source in a greater force in a numerical sense. That much we understand, because it's really typical of these battles. Say, even if, again, they had been less because the largest part of the enemy army had already been crushed, as we've seen, which is likely also from a numerical point of view, still the Christians were not fresh. So if Saladin had probably the heavier troops, the more picked ones, everything adds up in more than one way, right? If, however, we are looking at the fact of not having deployed basically in time, again having reformed, looking at the especially the enemies, that this possibility would be multiple contingents to attack once at a time. That may have been a strategic oversight, meaning armies would have formed at this point also in different lines, once again different divisions if anything. And so here William is also explicit about it. Had they reformed, but what if they had been two divisions, they had attacked the enemy in two different ways? Again, maybe they did, we're not even told, because normally that's how flexible the Christian armies were. Here it seems mostly like they had engaged all together. So again, it's not really clear what the hell happened. We only see that it was a disaster, and that of course things were not really how they should have gone in the eyes, especially of those who lost, obviously enough. But of course, it's a dramatic event, and more or less we have to understand here the logic behind it. It's not clear. Basically, William's suggestion is that somebody in the command had failed, and of course was their responsibility. There is this Renaud Sidon that is scapegoated a bit, like, if he had done the thing, but then it turns out that the greater issue is the Knights Templars master, and the question is why. What did this guy do? And it's literally not told. So it's very strange, and we don't understand really better what occurred in the picture. I would opt again for some rivalries, yes, but also some genuine success from Saladin's side in maintaining properly enough control and order of his troops in a critical moment that otherwise would have easily seen him defeated, right? That is also what we get from these battles. That, as we've seen, they're not overly central, but they're also the most important battles of the era, in a sense, in the secondary, in this immediate background after beyond the most important one, and therefore you can't sort of make up many excuses for it. This was a big clash. There was something that went wrong from the Christian side, and the Ayyubids won. It's simple as that. That's normally how warfare is, how simple warfare is, actually, by saying Clausewitzian definition, literally. Just we acknowledge our historical philological limit. We just don't know and can't know in thorough depth what concretely happened. But again, we will adapt to this. It's really how most warfare is at this point, and we actually have to be pretty thankful for works like William of Tyres, because it's unsurprisingly, in fact, one of the most insightful sources of the period. As far as you understand here, the prose is fairly complex. It's also fairly logical, so that's where when you know that he could have written what he really thought and he wouldn't. And so you understand that there was something behind this. And again, this defeat was not the end of the world, but it had innately, of course, been a great blow anyway. And one had to mediate between the political needs of a system that still needed not much of these feuds around in official histories, like William of Tyres one would be, and going on fighting against Saladin, right? So I'm really glad to expand on these Crusades battles because they feel incredibly underrated. From one side, you can understand how beautiful it is to study them, and I like to cluster them. I made lots of Crusades battles in the early days of Schwerpunkt, and I've even re-uploaded some of them, of course, and they are sort of too obsolete videos to be simply re-uploaded with new pictures. Again, part I already did, but they are beautiful battles. You can still listen to them, at least without specific care for visuals. In the last couple of years or so, we've really come to improve Schwerpunkt's content to a degree that I really hope is satisfactory. I see all these battles. Ramla 1105 is the third Ramla. Azad's 1125. Hattin 1187. Kherson 1187. These are all old videos that I should have really... One is actually a re-upload, the one about Hattin, right? But I'm not satisfied with the map and everything. The first one was better. I wish I had just kept it there. But I see that other videos have gotten, like in the last years, of course, more views, and that's what we go by. Again, the algorithm is a bit crazy. You may never know what's going to happen with AI, or whether this content will get buried under a pile of AI stuff, or there is enough room to prosper again, in a sense. I miss those days. I wish I had been at this point already back then, with everything done, etc. But unfortunately, that's also how you learn along the way. I just hope these videos are interesting, because I think they illustrate pretty well the complications. Not just reading a source. There are entire channels that say, oh my god, look, this channel is all based on source. They tell you, look at how this person thought at the time. Wow. And people think that that's simple history. That's history. That's straightforward history and correct history. And this gives such, a great level of, historical depth to the channel. There are people who are literally like that, right? As if quoting directly sources just per se was the issue. I think that videos like this that I base literally entirely on sources tell you pretty straightforwardly how complicated understanding these sources is, and how, in fact, you can't really make up what was going on. And for example, a battle like this is pretty mysterious. It's something you really want to try to understand better to a degree that evidently can't quite be gotten in that way. So it's humbling, and it really shows you how history is, like all the complications, all the actual difficulties in making things right. And again, making this right is more than difficult, as you understand. Can I add something to make the video longer? I don't know. Regarding, I don't know, here I'm modifying pictures to an extent. You always need stuff like that. I don't know. It seems like pictures especially are difficult to find for this stuff. As you understand, here show you only, like, if this is about the Ayyubids, it's going to be about Ayyubid stuff, right? I'm not going to put pictures of, say, I know, the Mamluk era, even though at some point they didn't look that different, telling the truth, or I don't know, some other time without care. The same goes for the Crusaders' armor. I was just before eliminating some stuff from Hastings that I had placed, because I said more or less, but it's too early, of course. And even though, of course, the armament, because I put it in haste to say, okay, let's simply fill this images up. I checked here some other pictures age while I was recording, right? So I really saved time in this regard. And yet again, it seems like most of the work is okay. Again, for the Ayyubids, I told you I'm expanding. Because this is what I always say, whatever hasn't been covered in the beginning will be in the end at some point. So there is nothing to be worried about if the Ayyubids, the Fatimids haven't come up so frequently. They're gonna in the future. It's just mathematical. For the rest, of course, a more homogeneous military historical work about Crusader states would be better. Like when I look at the playlist here, I realize it's just like, I don't know, 20, how much? Not even, well, the Crusades have enough. Crusader states less. Crusades 79, let me see. Because I include in the Crusade also the later medieval, the modern warfare stuff. It's mostly medieval. But Crusader states, such, how much are these? Well, they start becoming consistent. 24, this is the 25th video that I make. On the basis of the fact that I saw the Battle of Iran, that was yet another. What the hell is this noise outside? Just people outside, because I always freak out there are people in the apartment, because I came back to another apartment because my supercomputer got broke, and then I had brought it to repair, and I have just another computer here, and fortunately it's just 300 meters away, but I'm a bit paranoid about noises, and so I hear this. I have earplugs while I record, as well as when I sleep, for the same reason. But here there's a bit more noise, so I don't want it to bother the recording as well. What else? Not really much. Again, I'm thinking at some point how that some of these branches will be exhausted. I don't know. There are so many crusades, battles, and you can always come back on them. By the way, I prepared, for example, a video about the Battle of Bouvines. That I already made a video about the Battle of Bouvines. I made these incredibly important battles before time. For some reason, like in the early days of Schwerpunkt, Bouvines, Atten, Courtrai. Fortunately, other battles there are some of the most important in the Middle Ages, though, and there are some other battles that are more sort of famous and mostly for provincial issues, regional preferences around the world. But fortunately, we haven't covered, in fact, most of them either. But looking at battles in particular, there really are many. For example, we can tell you which ones we haven't done. We're going to make at some point. This is really, really important. Manzikert I did, and this was the only video I lost at some point. I already told it, but I will remain. That was, in fact, yet another battle I did very early on. And for technical reasons, I lost that video. Unfortunately, it was completely my fault. I deleted it during the uploading phase, but it was just like it happened to only 2 videos over 2,400. There's the Battle of Calaugra we haven't done. We made Durazzo, yes. Livonium we haven't. Dorelium we haven't. Antioch, yes. We still have to make Ascalon 1099. The first Ramla. The second Ramla in Jaffa. Harran we did. Also the third Ramla. Senabra we haven't done. Sarmin, also known as Tel Danith, we haven't done. Ager Sanguinis we did. Ab we haven't. Eski Zagra we haven't. Ibelin we haven't. Adzaz we have. March as Safar we haven't. Mount Katmos we haven't. Fons Moral, well, there is actually plenty of these battles, actually. I'm not going to spoiler them all, but some are really cool. Some are just even, I don't know, there is also Myriokephalon, for example, so it is not a crusade battle per se. It's Byzantines versus Turks, but in general, like, it fits the picture, because otherwise I wouldn't even know where to include, in fact, major Byzantine battles at some point. But from this very era, either in the West or in more Levantine context. In any case, it's actually plenty of big battles, and so I think that before we finish, this branch is gonna pass too much time. I'm not sure I'm going to leave long enough to cover this all. But I'm glad that at least we covered this, and so again, it's a blessing. Really for today, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.